But I'd love to start out, and I'm hopeful this will be a conversation among the three of you. I'll ask questions to keep it going, but as much as possible, I'd love you each to chime in. But I'd love to start out by defining our terms. Because the title of the panel is kind of having it both ways. It's about sustainability and resilience. There was a period at the Atlantic when I tried to ban the use of the term sustainability, just to force our writers to explain what they meant. And to some degree, resilience is now displacing it as at least as a buzzword. And I'm wondering, is there a real conceptual as opposed to semantic difference there that has tangible consequences for policy making? When you think in terms of resilience as opposed to sustainability, what direction does that point you in? Elizabeth, you want to start?
Well, I might start off by pointing out that since we're talking about climate change, we could differentiate the two actually in terms of the two climate change actions, which are mitigation and adaptation. And so for many years we were concerned with sustainability, which is essentially the mitigating actions to reduce emissions and to make us more responsible on the planet. But resilience now speaks to being ready for things that are happening that we may not have control over. And that's the adaptation response to climate change, which is learning how to be able to deal with and manage the change that we know is coming. And that's what's important, is that we know it's coming so we can plan for it.
Well, I think the two are obviously inextricably linked. If you look at what happened during Sandy, estimates are it was a $19 billion event in New York City. That same probability of storm, if it hit us in 2050 with the assumed sea level rise, would be a $90 billion event. So actions taken to reduce carbon emissions are going to have a great impact on the approach on resilience. But the way we define sustainability, really, if you look at our sustainability roadmap from 2007 that the mayor issued, is pretty broad-ranging. It really looked at quality of life issues across many different sectors in the city to accommodate 1 million new residents in the city. Looking at air quality, but also reduction of carbon emissions by 30% by 2030.
Back up a step there, Sergey, if you don't mind. You took over this current job. You'd been doing the mayor's energy policy before, but you took over your current job doing the Office of Sustainability a week, correct me if I'm wrong, right, before Sandy hit.
That's right.
Right? So you're new in this job. Biggest storm anybody could imagine hits. What was the experience of that for you? What were the lessons that you kind of learned in real time that you're trying to apply now?
Well, on the energy policy side, we had seen Hurricane Irene, two historic heat waves in the year prior to Sandy, and one of the efforts that we were really going to undertake was to look at how do we have climate scientists speak with regulators and utilities in a way to actually inform capital investment. And then, of course, Sandy actually hit. At the time, we actually had a working group of 40 infrastructure operators, and we were coming up with essentially a long-term capital investment plan across different classes of infrastructure. Now, the event itself, as you all know, is 800,000 customers lost power. So in other words, a couple million people, 7 hospitals evacuated. The damage on the coastline, 43 people died. So the experience that a lot of people in city government were in federal agencies, utilities. It was a massive, massive effort. And after the acute phase, after about the first month, when the mayor pulled together the team that would be working on their post-Sandy initiative led by Seth Pinsky, that report was delivered in June. And we have 267 initiatives looking at all classes of infrastructure, from the coastline to utilities to buildings to the food supply and hospitals, and really at the time there was really no blueprint for this kind of thing, and Mayor Diaz had obviously had tremendous experiences there. So the activities during the storm really informed us in the plan and really being able to address affected communities, and also looking out in the future what might happen, not just if another storm hit us of that magnitude, but if heat waves of different magnitude or wind events or other events were to impact New York City.
Mr. Mayor, you were actually ahead of New York, really, in moving aggressively to begin mitigating some of the effects of climate change. Can you talk a little bit about your experience doing that? What provoked it in the first place? And then how did you go about enlisting the kind of experts, the group that you needed to actually think through a new zoning plan for Miami?
Well, you know, I'll get to that, but I want to go back to where the three of you started, which is in trying to explain what sustainability, what resilience, what global warming, what climate change, what all those terms mean. Because here's a difficulty, and I'm sure there are some mayors here and some of my former colleagues. The biggest problem is that after we're done intellectually discussing those terms and hearing the very eloquent presentation the Vice President made, all of us have to go and explain it to a constituency that isn't as focused on the issue as the rest of us are. And after all, we're generating 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, so as Walter said earlier, think global, but you have to act locally. So the problems have to be resolved at the local level. In order to resolve it at the local level, I have to convince my constituents and the mayor's constituents that this is an important undertaking for a city. So at the end of the day, it has to be explained in a way that people understand. And mayors have evolved through this process. When I got elected in 2001, I had a very strong environmental record. Environmental, clean water, clean air, you know, typical type of environmental issues. I also knew that the city of Miami was growing in a very haphazard, unplanned sort of way. So instinctually, I moved ahead with a plan that became what we call Miami 21, not really understanding or connecting the dots, but as mayors go, practical, learn as you go, on the job. As we were developing this in 2005, really two things happened, Kyoto and Inconvenient Truth. And all of a sudden, there was a connection made between the importance, the absolute importance of how a city is designed and the environment. And that was an aha moment for me, as I'm sure it's been for a lot of people. And you begin to understand that a city like New York, for example, that is generally recognized as America's most environmentally friendly city, it's because it was designed by somebody a very, very long time ago with a public transportation system that made it work. And so in the US Conference of Mayors, and I don't know if former Mayor Greg Nichols is here from Seattle, but in '05, he starts to gather a group of us to sign something called the US Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, which is the implementation of Kyoto at the local level. Since again, the United States refused to be a signatory, mayors take it upon themselves and say, okay, you guys won't do it, doesn't matter anyway, cities are the ones that have to do it. We all signed this agreement, and today there are over 1,100 mayors that have signed on, and each have varying versions of a local climate protection plan being implemented in their cities because, of course, the United States does not have one. We don't have an energy plan. We don't have a budget. We don't have anything. We don't even have people working in Washington. But as Mayor Bloomberg said earlier today, the good news is they're going to get paid when they do get back to work. So anyway, so what Miami 21 did is it brought focus to many of us as to the connectivity between the importance of designing cities that work, cities that are pedestrian friendly, mixed use, walkable, with a public transportation system, and the favorable impact that has for the environment. And for example, one of the elements of Miami 21 is that we require everybody that's going to build at least to a minimum of silver LEED certified. I actually thought I was going to get a lot of pushback from the development community. I got none. But when I talked to the development community, frankly, I convinced them this way. First, I brought in colleagues, their contemporaries, developers, architects, engineers, interior designers, everybody from the real estate industry, down in Miami that I could find from New York, Boston, and other places, Northwest, that had been in the development and design of green buildings for a very long time. Brought them down to speak to their colleagues to show them that A, it can be done. It can be done for about, if there's any increase, it's a nominal increase of the cost of regular, non-certifiable buildings. And at the same time, it's going to save you a lot of money in operating costs. It's going to increase the resale value of that building. It's going to increase tenant retention, rents. So it makes business sense for you. So when I met with developers, I did not show them pictures of icebergs melting. I showed them why green, in terms of their pocketbook, made sense for them to do green buildings. And even before Miami 21 became law, they had embraced the concept. And in 2005, we had 0 green buildings in Miami. We now have over 200.
Sergey, has this been part of the issue for you in New York, is bringing people into conversation with each other who are otherwise kind of talking past each other? Yeah, I mean, your own team is multidisciplinary, as I understand it, but getting the climate scientists and the regulators to actually speak the same language.
Yeah, I think that's right. On our team, for example, we have a combination of engineers, architects, economists, policy analysts, and they're all working on different things, from green buildings to working with regulators in the utility sector. But I think one thing that's interesting, we're seeing a tremendous period of innovation right now in the energy sector, and also in different types of distributed resources. If you look at, for example, our green infrastructure plan for our water system is really revolutionizing the way that we're spending money and looking at water supplies. And if you look at in the energy sector right now, I mean, as I said, there's really no roadmap. We have, a tremendous utility infrastructure that's served us well for many decades. It's a marvel of engineering in many ways, but we're looking at also how do distributed systems integrate into the utility backbone. How do you create new business models for things like microgrids? How do you put renewables and CHP plants and other technologies into that system? How do you understand how much money to spend on critical nodes in the network? That's really, I think that's a tremendous period that we're going through right now, and I think we're going to see a lot of changes happen over the next year.
Elizabeth, let me return to your point about adaptation earlier. I think many of us lay people look at this and think, well, perhaps the most extreme form of adaptation would be actually moving people out of the flood zone, right, and just abandoning certain areas as essentially not sensibly inhabitable anymore. Is that at all part of the Miami plan?
Well, there is no Miami plan that is that detailed yet. The New York plan, the More Resilient New York, has begun to deal with issues like that and actually costing them out for New York. But, adaptation it's not universal the way mitigation is. It has to be done every place uniquely. It's regional. It's highly local and regional. And one of the great things is that New York has shown us a plan of how that might be able to be done. It might be difficult for small cities to do that, and you have to do that probably banding together to figure those things out, which is not normal. So asking many municipalities in a region to work together, and also asking the public and private sector to work together to develop these plans is going to be brand new. It's the kind of interdisciplinary work that you've just described, where people have to come together and figure out if you have to raise a road, if that's really the best solution somewhere to remain in that place, let's say on Miami Beach. What happens to the public sector can pay for that. That's hard enough. What happens to the private properties on either side of it that will now be under the road? How do you manage that kind of change? And so there are many different ways of adapting, and they're all specific to different locations. And it's different for us because we have a different substrata than it is for North Carolina or New York. So there's a lot of figuring out to do, but it's not impossible. And we are going to have to learn how to work collaboratively in new ways in public, because of course everybody always wants to know what's going on, especially with their own property.
So who, and this is a question to any one of you who wants to take it, who drives that if it's a question of several cities banding together? What's the proper role for the federal government, if any, here?
I'm not sure it's a federal responsibility, maybe federal responsibility. I'm not sure they'll have a role in it. But in South Florida, 4 counties have gotten together. It's the 4-County Climate Compact, which is beginning to work on these things and has been already for several years. Their county commissions ratified that they should work together and that the various departments in the cities might do that. We need to extend that to 7 counties to really make it efficient. But it's a slow-moving process. Those are the positive steps. There's a lot more that needs to be done.
It's a very scary scenario for local governments. Probably the federal government's role will be to raise flood insurance rates. That's probably how they'll deal with this. Cities aren't getting transportation funding like we used to. We're not getting any funding. In fact, water and infrastructure, water infrastructure expenditures just a few decades ago were, the brunt of it was 75, 80% federal funding. The balance was local. Now it's 95% local. So the federal government and most of our state governments have completely abdicated any responsibility for what they deem to be local issues. Of course, when New York floods, when New Jersey floods, when Louisiana or Miami flood, the feds and FEMA have to step in. So at the end of the day, it all does go back to becoming a national problem. But from the outset, they just say, that's a local problem, you guys deal with it. The problem is that our budgets are incredibly strained, and we have only so much bonding capacity. And the kinds of investments that we're talking about here, in terms of really hardening our assets, are really, really substantial. And I go back to my first point, is we really haven't convinced our voters, our constituents, that mitigation is important. So it's kind of hard to take them from, I haven't convinced you about mitigation, to we're going to spend billions of dollars in adaptation. So I think first and foremost, we have to get through that. But yes, I mean, cities are not going to be able to do it by themselves. There's going to have to be federal and state assistance.
We should point out one thing, though, in fairness to this administration. There was a series of grants to encourage regions to work regionally on some of these issues, the Sustainable Communities grants, which was, and this was brand new, that HUD, DOT, and EPA were asked to work together on this kind of regional picture for the first time. We don't know if that's going to continue. We think maybe it will not. But those Sustainable Communities grants did enable some parts of the country to at least come together, start talking within the governments about cooperating, within the local governments about cooperating on these issues.
And just as an example of how regional the problem can be, if you look at what happened during Sandy, when the northern New Jersey power grid went down, our gasoline supply was interrupted. 4 days of gasoline were not being pumped from the Colonial Buckeye pipeline system in New York City. The maritime infrastructure was also damaged in the New York Harbor, all the way down to the refineries in Philadelphia. So we had a severe gasoline and diesel shortage that was entirely a regional issue. So that's just one example. You know, power grids, pipelines across state boundaries.
But Sergey, in terms of building, what the mayor referred to, building support for these sorts of dramatic actions, has Sandy changed the politics around those questions in New York in an enduring way, do you think?
I think people are very passionate about the topic, and I think one of the things that we decided early on was that we wanted as much community input as possible, particularly for some of the communities that were directly affected, and I think that ended up filtering directly into the plan. We have, for example, different types of coastal measures that we've looked at, something like $3.7 billion of coastal measures from, strengthening dunes and wetlands to very specific community, bulkheads and seawalls and critical infrastructure protection. So I think you have to. It can't be a centrally planned exercise completely. It needs the input from the community. You
mentioned community. As I understand it, one of the tenets of resilience theory is that the tangible stuff's really important. The intangible stuff of communities pulling together and finding their way through these sorts of problems actually turns out to be crucial. The kind of community that's at the heart of the new urbanist philosophy, Elizabeth. And I wonder, to what extent, as you devise these sorts of plans, do you think about somehow creating the conditions for the organic creation of those sorts of communities?
Well, many of us have thought that building of community and maintaining of community is important no matter what, regardless of mitigation, regardless of need for adaptation. But the New Yorker this year had a wonderful article which described the communities that fared variously in Chicago during the heat wave, and in which a place that had a certain kind of community structure, both physically and socially, fared much better.
Regardless of income level.
Regardless of income level. And so I think we're beginning to understand through research and through those kinds of observations that community and social interdependence is actually a great way to be resilient, perhaps as good as buying a pair of boots for your household. A great way to bring people together to be able to help each other under whatever circumstances might come their way.
But how do you make that part of a gigantic plan for mitigating and adapting to climate change? How do you actually build that into it?
So you can't force a community to exist, but I think you can make a physical fabric that would enable it or encourage it rather than prevent it. I think that's something we've learned a lot about. There was a lot of mention of Jane Jacobs this morning, and there's been a lot of work done since her writing. I think we have a lot of experience about that. And some of the great concerns voiced during the day were about how to maintain that community across the various divides of whether they are financial or cultural. You're about to have a cultural session, which I think will speak to that.
Sergey, is it part of the New York plan as well?
Yes, it is. I think if you look at what happened during the storm, a lot of the informal networks end up being incredibly important in solving problems. One aspect of where you can help communities is if you look at so the outages that happened, they were large swaths of New York City that were just out, from Empire State Building all the way down to the bottom, the entire Rockaways Peninsula for a while. So some of the solutions we're also looking for are how do you create pockets of resilience where people can recharge their cell phones and emergency generator plans so that gas stations and supermarkets and hospitals can be kind of beacons during an outage if it were to happen. So there are many examples like that, but that's one.
In closing, I'd love to hear some sense from either of, I guess from you two particularly, of as you said about this work, where did you turn to for models? How do you kind of communicate with each other so that what is the way that you share best practices so that each city doesn't wind up reinventing, I mean, with allowances for the fact that all mitigation ultimately or adaptation is local, there surely are some best practices to be shared here. So how did you go about finding those?
Well, for me, it was working with colleagues around the country and seeing what they were doing. And we were always publishing either in hard copy or online best practices from different cities. And it was really just a matter of copying what others were doing. Others would call you about what you were doing. And in the area, and that's sort of on the general mitigation area, on the area of response and resiliency, obviously, we've had to deal with hurricanes forever. And so we have a pretty good book, game plan on how to deal with hurricanes, how to react to hurricanes, the things that you were talking about, gas stations and making sure supermarkets are up. Because let's face it, the good news about hurricanes is they're coming, not like a tornado. where you sort of wake up in the middle of the night and your roof is gone. At least here you have some warning. And so if you do what you're supposed to do and you take the right steps, you know, I mean, a Cat 5 is a Cat 5. And, you know, in some cases, I don't care how much you prepare, it's still a Cat 5. And it's hard to beat Mother Nature when it's that strong. But generally, you can survive it. So the question really becomes what happens afterwards. And that really, from a policy perspective, is sometimes the most frustrating, because all of a sudden people are without power. Generally come in the summer, so it's August in Miami, so it can be very warm. You're without power, you're without water, you can't get gasoline, you know, gas, your car. So you begin to have all these sense of frustrations that you can't just pick up and go the next day or in the next couple of days. Sometimes, in prior cases, people have been down for a month. And you want to talk about tempers boiling. That'll do it. So you begin to create those kinds of stopgap measures dealing with gas stations and the ability to go get gas right away, or be up and have generators, and all the stores are open so you can get food. Your food is rotting, you know, rotten now in the refrigerator. So all those things are important. And obviously, after years and decades of practice, we've got it down to pretty good science.
Please, Elizabeth, you have the final word.
You know, in terms of adaptation, I would say that some of what's going on here today is one way that we learn about what other people are doing. A big theme today was innovation. And how do you find out about the latest things that people are doing? And so the kind of reporting of observation, studies, writing about it can be very important, because you really have to learn, like you said, real time. And then that experience becomes very important and can be used maybe only a few months later. It's not going to go in the history books. You really need to learn it now. So all the kinds of communication that can pass that experience along in a short amount of time are really very important.
All right, well, thank you all for sharing your experiences with us.